In today's lesson, we'll be taking a closer look at population growth, how populations grow, and how we measure it, as well as some of the possible consequences of this growth. We have two main goals in today's lesson. First, we will be beginning by exploring demography, the study of populations. We'll be doing this by looking at some basic metrics for calculating population growth. We'll look at natural increase rates and how we calculate that by looking at birth rates and death rates. We'll learn about fertility rates, and we'll learn about dependence load. In the second half of the lesson, we will be looking at Thomas Malthus and his theories on population growth. We will examine what Malthus argued, explore the historical context and timelines of some of Malthus's predictions, and finally, we'll evaluate the effectiveness of Malthusian theory. So to begin with, we need to lay some groundwork for how we're going to study population growth. And we'll start by looking at this idea of demographics or demography. And what that word means, it's basically the study of populations. It's a general category for any academic discipline or look at the study of population. And within demography, there are many basic metrics that we can use to study populations. And here are perhaps some of the most basic ones that we need to understand. The first one is birth rate. Now, a birth rate is simply the number of births per 1,000 people in a population in a year. The death rate, on the other hand, is simply the number of deaths per 1,000 people in a population for a given year. And by using these two numbers, we can calculate the natural increase, which is simply birth rate minus death rate. And what this is telling us is it's telling us how many people are being added to or subtracted from a population every year based on a natural increase, or the number of people being born and dying. So when a natural increase is positive, in other words, the birth rate is higher than the death rate, that means that a population is growing. On the other hand, when death rates are higher than birth rates, a population is shrinking. It's becoming smaller over time. And within this study of demography, we can see connections to the demographic transition model. So the model is based on using these statistics of birth rates and death rates, and what those relationships are, what the ratios are of birth rates to death rates, whether you have a high birth rate and a high death rate, low birth rates and high death rates, will determine where you are, which stage you're in of the demographic transition model. So looking here, this chart here is showing us the top 10 countries with the highest birth rates in 2016. And as you can see here, there's a few things that these countries all have in common. All 10 of these countries are from the continent of Africa, and all of these countries are what we would classify as being less developed countries. These would be countries with very low Human Development Index scores. And by looking at the side here, we can see what we would consider a high birth rate. All of these countries here have birth rates above, in the 40s, high 30s. Conversely, here is the bottom 10 countries with the lowest birth rates in the world. And you can see they're far lower here, between 6 and 8.5. And these are countries, on the other hand, that are much more developed. All of these countries here we would consider, for the most part, to be highly developed. And they are from primarily from Europe, so countries like Germany and Slovenia. And on the other hand, we have places from the Far East, so places like South Korea and Japan. Those places tend to have lower birth rates. And another look here. These are the top 10 countries in the world by death rate. Now, this can be because of a variety of reasons. These countries are on this list for different reasons. So it could be because of disease. So for example, Lesotho, which is the number 1 country on this list by death rate at 14.9 deaths per 1,000 people. Lesotho is one of the countries in Africa that's been hardest hit by the AIDS epidemic. So that would explain why they have such a high death rate. In other cases, though, it's because of war. So for example, Afghanistan being on this list due to their civil war. It could be due to poverty. So a country like Chad, for example, which has a very low HDI score and high rates of poverty. Or it could be because of an aging population. So a country like Russia simply has a high number of people dying every year because they have an aging population. There's more old people in their population. And so a related stat, a stat that's related to birth rates, is something called fertility rate. It's just another measurement for how many people are being born every year. But what this stat tries to do is it tries to put it into the context of how many children a woman is having in her lifetime. And this kind of makes it a little easier for us to imagine, to put it into context. So for example, as of 2016, the country with the highest fertility rate is Niger, where a woman has on average 7.2 children in her lifetime. On the other hand, the country with the lowest fertility rate is Singapore, where women have on average 1.2 children. So this again just puts it in a little more context and lets us imagine how many children a woman is actually having, as opposed to birth rates where the metric is per thousand people. And finally, another statistic that we want to understand is dependency load. The dependency load is simply the percentage of a population that is either a child or an older adult. And our definition for child in this context is someone under the age of 15, and an older adult is someone over the age of 65. And then anyone between these ages we would consider a working adult. And now it's important to know this because these age groups, children under 15 and adults over the age of 65, are particularly vulnerable, and they depend on working adults for survival. So children can't really provide for themselves. They need their parents to help take care of them. And older adults, they might be retiring, they can't really work as long, they might be sick and need taken care of. They rely on others for their survival. So this is important because countries with high dependency loads, high percentages of their population under 15 and or over 65, they need to deal with very specific issues. So things like healthcare, things like childcare, things like employment. If you have a high dependency load, that's fewer people who are, eligible to be in the workforce. So it's important to know this statistic in order to understand which of these issues a country might have to deal with. Now, with these metrics in mind, let's move on to take a look at one of the most influential, as well as perhaps the most controversial figures in the study of demographics. This man right here, Thomas Malthus. Now, the Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus, he was an English cleric and economist who worked in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And the historical context here is important. So he's working in a time when there's widespread poverty. He's working in London, a big city. There's lots of poverty, lots of poor people, lots of people in the streets. There's lots of women not able to feed their children, women having many children. There's disease outbreaks. So Malthus he's living and working around this all the time. Think Oliver Twist, the Charles Dickens story that's sort of set around this time. This is sort of the context of where Malthus is coming up with a lot of his ideas about population. And soon afterwards, after Malthus publishes his work, an essay on the principle of population in 1798, his most influential work, it had a major impact on how governments and how people and how economists and how academics viewed demography. So in the decades following, in the mid-19th century, for example, the Irish potato famine occurs. And it seems to prove a lot of his ideas right. So he's given a lot of credence for a long time. Now, Malthus argued that while food production grows linearly, populations grow geometrically. So while food production grows in a fairly straight line, populations are doubling all the time. So Malthus concluded that populations would inevitably grow to a point where there would no longer be enough food to support them, leading to widespread famine, disease, and death. And he likened this relationship to the one found between rabbits and foxes in nature. So here this graph is showing the rabbit versus fox population over time. So what's happening here is that when there's a lot of rabbits, there's a lot of food for the foxes. Foxes prey on rabbits. So there's more food for foxes, allowing more foxes to survive. More foxes survive into adulthood, more foxes reproduce. There's more foxes. the fox population explodes. Eventually, however, there are more foxes than the rabbit population can sustain, so the fox population runs out of food. This leads to starvation, death, etc. So lots of foxes start to die. Now that the foxes have died, rabbits have fewer predators, and they can start reproducing. More rabbits live into adulthood. They live longer. There are more rabbits, and their population explodes. And over time, this cycles through. And on this graph here, it almost looks like a sine wave. There's a very clear relationship between the rabbit and fox populations. As one goes up, the other declines, etc. Now, Malthus thought this was the natural relationship between populations and their food, and that humans would inevitably become victims to this trend. And so this graph here is showing what Malthus believed would happen as the human population grew. So he predicted that over time, human populations would continue to grow geometrically. They would continue to double very slowly over time, and that eventually population would increase at such a rapid rate that growth in food production would not be able to keep up with it. And where those points meet is called the carrying capacity. This is the number of individuals that a given environment can support. So Malthus was predicting that this wasn't very far off at the turn of the 19th century. He looked around, he saw poverty, disease, and starvation in London, and he assumed that this was the natural course of things, that this was the result of a too fast-growing population. And he concluded that the Earth must be near or at its carrying capacity, and that the population of the world was about to contract, much like the foxes and the rabbits. However, in reality, the exact opposite happened. This is exactly when the world population starts to explode, and we start to see this rapid growth in human population, going from about 1 billion people at the time that Malthus is living, up to 7.5 billion today, and continuing to grow at a rapid pace. So what happened? There's a lot that's going on here, but sort of the biggest thing that Malthus failed to take into account was humanity's ability to adapt and innovate. And there are three major changes in society that are happening right around the time that Malthus is writing and throughout the 19th century. And they are the Industrial Revolution, improvements to healthcare, and better sanitation. So let's look at those one at a time. So this first factor is the Industrial Revolution. Now this is a period of rapid transition from manual labor to machinery for manufacturing. And it starts to happen in the late 1700s in Western Europe and in the Americas. This is the time when the steam engine is invented. So the steam engine is invented in the early 1700s. James Watt's steam engine from 1778 is a major step forward. It was way more efficient than manual labor, and as well as other engine designs at the time. So this made manufacturing both easier and more efficient. And it had applications directly to food production. So for example, out of this you get things like tractors on farms. You have mechanical plows that can harvest crops quicker. But there are other innovations going on at the time too. So Jethro Tull's seed drill, for example, makes planting crops quicker, cheaper, and more effective. The concept of crop rotation starts to take hold, and fertilizers begin to be used on farms, both of which increase food yields. There's also the idea of land enclosure, which becomes popular in Europe and particularly Britain around this time. So land enclosure is essentially the idea of private property for farming. And this is a new concept to people. You're more likely to want to take care of your crops and take care of the seeds that you've planted if you know that they're yours. And that there's no chance that your neighbor's cows are going to graze on the seeds that you just planted. You take pride and ownership of what you have and what you own. So as a result of these factors, we saw dramatic increases in food production during the 19th century, far outpacing what Malthus had predicted. It was more than just a linear increase in production. Another factor is improvements to healthcare during this time. So there are many major advances in medicine that start to take place, and we'll go through 4 of those. The first is the use of antiseptics in hospital to help prevent infections. So previously, doctors didn't commonly wash their hands when performing procedures. In fact, when it was first suggested to doctors supervising childbirths that they should wash their hands, most doctors found this concept insulting. It implied that they were dirty. So it took a while to overcome this sort of cultural misconception, but as a result, it helped to save lives. Secondly, we see the introduction of anesthetics for surgeries. So in 1772, the chemist Joseph Priestley discovers nitrous oxide, otherwise known as laughing gas. And physicians observed that patients felt no pain while they were under its influence. Now, this is important because before this, most surgeries were performed while the patient was fully conscious. So as a result of having anesthetic, it allows for more invasive and life-saving surgeries to take place that otherwise would be difficult or impossible to pull off. And anesthetic becomes widely used around the time of the American Civil War and takes off from there. A third advancement was that the first vaccines were introduced in the 1870s, so this gave people immunity to otherwise crippling or deadly diseases. And finally, new medical technologies are invented around this time. So things like the stethoscope, which is invented in 1816, and X-rays, invented later on, they give doctors a window into the human body, which they hadn't had before. So all of this means that people are living longer, healthier lives than they had at any point in their history. Death rates start to decrease rapidly, leading to an increase in the population. And finally, we could look at sanitation as a factor leading to this increase in population. So by the 1800s, this is when the germ theory of disease finally starts to gain a scientific consensus. And as a result, we see a reduce in the spread of disease as people begin to understand the importance of things we take for granted today. So things like hand washing, for example, would not have been common before, or bathing frequently. These sorts of things, which again today are common nature, would not have been common practice in the 1800s. We also have Louis Pasteur, who invents the process of pasteurization as a way of killing pathogens in food. So understanding that bacteria and fungus can grow on food and make people sick, being able to understand that process allows for solutions to the problem. And that's what Louis Pasteur came up with, a solution to the problem. It was also in the late 1890s that viruses were discovered. So there's a better understanding of what's causing people to become sick. And finally, we also see civil sanitation projects. So sanitation in cities is improved drastically during this time. So for example, the construction of the London sewer system in response to cholera outbreaks during the 1800s. This is a major improvement, as before this, the River Thames was being used as an open sewer. Now having sewage being taken out and water being treated leads to fewer disease outbreaks within cities. So all of these factors created the conditions to not only avoid a population collapse, it led to an explosion in the global population. And Malthus really failed to account for human progress and innovation. It's really not good to just assume that humans will inevitably become victims to natural forces. We're not the same as foxes and rabbits. Humans are the most intelligent creatures on Earth, and this allows us to adapt and change our environment like no other animal. And this is something not only that started in the 1800s, we've been doing this for thousands of years. So for example, early humans using fire to cook meat so that it lasted longer. Humans wearing clothes so that they could live in colder climates, domesticating animals to use for food or to do work. These are all examples of humans, again, adapting to their environment, changing their environment, doing things that no other animals do. We've been approaching problems and solving them for a long, long time, and Malthus did not take this into account when proposing his theory. Now, that doesn't mean that Malthus is not respected today. There are many demographers who still call upon Malthus's theories to try to explain what's going on with the world population today. And many of these neo-Malthusians would argue that the global population cannot keep growing at its current pace, that we've reached our carrying capacity or already exceeded it, and that new problems are going to eventually correct the population. So, for example, neo-Malthusians might look at something like climate change as an inevitable population check. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is, will science and technology continue to advance to keep up with population growth? Can we keep innovating, and can we keep solving these problems as they arise? And I think the answer is yes. We've proven this time and time again as a species. It's definitely possible. How we approach these problems and the kinds of solutions that we come up with, they might not be easy, but humans have shown a capacity to do this before. So I would argue that looking at this as an inevitable consequence of population growth, as Malthus seems to imply, is not the best way of going about things. But there's definitely a lot of debate in the field of demography about Malthus and his theories to this very day. So in summary, today we learned that demography is the study of populations. We learned that a population's natural increase rate is calculated by subtracting death rate from birth rate. We learned that dependency load is a percentage of population under 15 years old and over 65 years old. We learned that Thomas Malthus observed that while food production grows linearly, populations grow geometrically, and consequently predicted that human populations would inevitably crash in something he called a Malthusian catastrophe. And finally, despite Malthus's predictions, global populations have exploded since the 1800s due to advances in industry, medicine, and sanitation.